Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's John. This is my book review, which has been getting later and later in the week, unfortunately. I'm going to pre-record the next two, so they're actually on time. For this week, it is March 5th, 2022. I want to bring you a review today of a book that I bought last year during the Princeton University 75% off sale. That looked really interesting to me. And by the way, their sale for 2022, also 75% off sale, just ended on the 28th, I believe. Swooped down, took advantage of that as well, and bought about 16 or 18 books. I'll be showing those within the next few weeks in lieu of a book review. So just wanted to let you know that's coming up relatively soon. But one of the books that I bought last year was sort of like this perennially interesting figure in philosophy, for me at least, who is Heidegger. This is a book by Richard Wolin, named or called Heidegger's Children. Hannah Arendt, Carl Lowith, Hans Jonas, and Herbert Marcuse. The reference to children there is a little problematic. It's like I say in the body of the review, I think it connotes some connections that aren't necessarily extant in the degree that the author would like them to be. But the four people named in the subtitle there are students of Heidegger at one time in his life, mostly in the 20s and 30s, when he had his biggest, shall we say, issues with his Nazi affiliations. Well, I guess that was mostly the 30s, but I mean, he still had some. I'll go into a little bit of detail about that in the review itself. So this is about one guy who had some very, very problematic ideas and some discoveries in the last decade or so, namely a set of journals that he kept for about 35 years during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, called the Black Notebooks, which were discovered, I think, in 2014. Scholars were always sort of more than eager to give Heidegger the benefit of the doubt as to actually how much sympathy he displayed towards the Nazis. But when those notebooks were discovered, less than 10 years ago, it really left no doubt that Heidegger was an affirmed anti-Semitic card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. And what this book tries to do is reconcile these four students, all of whom, by the way, are culturally Jewish, even if they were not necessarily practicing religious Jews, how they reconcile their Jewishness and their work as philosophers and cultural critics with Heidegger's virulent anti-Semitic behavior and participation in the Nazi Party. Richard Wolin has been actively pointing to what he thinks. Richard Wolin is the author of the book. Pointing to what he thinks to be the academic and moral shortcomings of many intellectuals he's mainly a critic of what he calls the fascist left. Not a term I would choose, but throughout the 20th century. He's written books with titles like The Seduction of Unreason, The Intellectual Romance with Fascism from Nietzsche to Postmodernism, and The Wind from the East, from intellectuals, the Cultural Revolution, and the Legacy of the 1960s. So he talks a lot about, I guess, revolutionary, not necessarily revolutionary in a Marxist sense, but or leftist revolutionary, but sort of I don't think anyone's going to call Heidegger a revolutionary leftist. Um, but he was sort of one of those thinkers that people really were entranced by in the 20th century, for better or worse. He's certainly going to argue for worse. And he's interested in how these intellectual affinities between these dynamic, sort of magus like teachers create very worshipful bodies of students, both students that they directly interact with and bodies of students whose work they influence all over the world, right? So, like I said, he calls this sort of these many of the people that he writes about left fascists, or and what they do is he'll give an intellectual background of the person that he's talking about, in this case Heidegger, and then talk about some of the intellectual developments that he sort of wants to hitch a bandwagon onto the back of, and criticize them because of their associations with one another. For anyone who's familiar with the work of Margulilla, or Lila, Lilla, he wrote a book called The Reckless Mind, Intellectuals and Politics, which I reviewed on this channel. Largely follows that same pattern and presentation. Heidegger's Children looks at 4 of his students, who themselves all came to become highly regarded. I mean, probably most familiar with Arendt and Marcuse, but Lowith and Jonas are also relatively, certainly worth reading, I would argue, in their own right. And interestingly enough, and here's the the sort of thing that's interesting, and you have to keep in mind, they're all culturally Jewish. You would think someone like Heidegger would either not associate with Jewish students, or that his students would be so grossed out by his ideas that they wouldn't want to attend his lectures. But as you'll see over and over again, especially with Hannah Arendt, she maintains, after she has an initial affair with him in, I think, the 20s, they might break off for a while, but they're off and on again through the 1960s. I mean, and the whole time she knows what he thought and what he did. It's just, I mean, it's a fascinating sort of cognitive dissonance that might have been going on in her mind. I don't know. I would love to be able to raise her from the dead for an hour and have a conversation with her relationship with Heidegger about her. But however carefully scholars want to walk on eggshells around Heidegger, like I was saying earlier, there is absolutely no doubt today that during his rectorship in 1933 at the University of Freiburg, which was held under the auspices and in close collaboration with the National Socialist Party, he held and espoused and taught openly Nazi ideas. Above and beyond this, his sympathies with the party continued, such that his students, some more than others clearly, felt the need to distance themselves from him. His persistent metaphysical anti-Semitism is apparent to anyone who cares to read the Black Notebooks, like I just mentioned, written over a period from 1931 to 1959, but only published, I think, around 2014, last decade. In any case, even his dimmest of students must have realized the affinities between his special brand of obscurantist thought and the volkishness that rested behind Nazi thought. Despite his opinions, Heidegger gained a reputation as a fascinating, charismatic teacher whose ideas offered the respite of hope from the failed project that everyone also lived through, which was democratic Weimar Germany, which ended up being a complete failure. The book proceeds in a somewhat predictable way. Wolin gives a brief biographical sketch of Heidegger first, and then each of his 4 students, and discusses their work and why it was important. And I think these are the major strengths of the book. Oddly enough, as Hans Jonas and Karl Lowith get little to no attention on their own, these are nice, serviceable chapters that sort of sum up the history of their work and why it was important to read and how it was received in the history of intellectual and philosophical thought. Wolin then goes on to criticize and sort of pick nits at each one of the 4 for not having separated themselves from what he sometimes refers to very condescendingly as the Black Forest sage. Heidegger notoriously had a little cottage in the Black Forest that he liked to leave as infrequently as possible. And this is where a lot of the problematic whitewashing happens on the author's part. And it's unfortunate because it detracts from what I think would otherwise be a really helpful introduction to Heidegger's most famous and philosophically established students and how he influenced them. But the one glaring problem in Wolin's thesis is, of course, that not all of his students' work was equally haunted by Heidegger's errors. We can see this mistake coming a mile away with the awkwardly inaccurate title of his book, Heidegger's Children, somehow denoting a thoroughgoing reliance on Heidegger's thought for all of them, when that's just simply not the case. And if you read all 4 of the chapters on his students, you'll see how they depended on Heidegger's ideas in varyingly, in degrees that varied widely. Perhaps the most disappointing behavior on display by any of Heidegger's students is the excuse-making. I mean, it's really the only word I have for it, that Hannah Arendt engages in on the part of her former teacher for decades after the war. Like I said, I think they last meet sometime in 1968 or something like that. I mean, Heidegger, the evil never die, right? He goes on to live another 10 years after 1966 or 68. He lives an incredibly long life. In the case of Hans Jonas and Karl Lowith, the connections with Heidegger's thought are very tenuous, almost minor. They don't even really merit mention, almost. But Wolin still insists on referring to these 2 people as Heidegger's children. I just think at the end of the day, hitching some of Heidegger's most famous students onto his wagon of bad intellectual habits and obscurantism and a lifetime of regrettable political decisions, and then just sort of artlessly declaiming that biography is history, falls short of the level of analysis that Heidegger's students deserve, and dare I say even that Heidegger himself deserves. But if you want some really canned biography, and by canned I don't mean poor, like I said, I think those are the strengths of the book. The reason why I gave it, I gave it 3 stars on Goodreads. I'd gladly give it 3.5. I just wanted to get the criticisms out there and explain why I don't think it's quite 4-star material, because of the overweening argument it tries to make. But the introductions of especially the lesser known, I mean, you're probably already familiar with Arendt, but Marcuse, Jonas, and Lowith are just really good. Really, really, really good. So, if you're interested, go ahead and check this book out. It's Heidegger's Children, Hannah Arendt, Karl Lowith, Hans Jonas, and Herbert Marcuse. by Richard Wolin. I will see everyone next week with an on-time book review on Wednesday.